Hey guys, welcome back. We are on chapter 11, Catastrophes. The chapter before was about Christmas and how Fudge made everybody write a letter to Santa. And at the end, we discovered that Fudge does not believe in Santa. Who would have thought? Okay. Dad stopped talking about his book. I had the feeling it wasn't going very well. Instead, he talked about growing vegetables and how to cook them Chinese style, or about the Princeton University hockey team. He took me to all their home games. When Jimmy Fargo came to visit, he joined us. I'm really into violence, Jimmy said. I think hockey's a great game. It's a lot bloodier than football, and there are more team fights. That's not what hockey is about, Dad argued. It's a game of skill, timing, and precision. Yeah, I know all of that, Jimmy said, but it's still great to see the blood bounce on the ice. Blood bounces on ice, I said. Yeah, and so does vomit. See, it has to do with the temperature of the ice versus the temperature of the body. Jimmy, please, Dad said, turning green. It's true, Mr. Hatcher. They both bounce on ice. Maybe so, but that's not why we go to games. I know, but it's a nice side event. Dad shook his head and began to check off players' names on the list inside his program. Jimmy leaned across me and tapped Dad's arm. I'm not a violent person, Mr. Hatcher. Don't get me wrong. It's just that it's a healthy way to use up some of my aggressive energy. Hey, Jimmy, I said. Yeah? Shut up. Okay, sure, Jimmy said. And he was quiet until nearly the end of the third period when 4 of the players got into a fight. And then he stood up and yelled, "Kill!" I tugged at his sweater until he sat down. Later, when I was in bed and Jimmy was in a sleeping bag, he said, I've been seeing the school psychologist twice a week. She says I have a lot of anger because my parents split up. Take my word for it, Peter. Divorce is a catastrophe. You should watch your parents all the time and listen to every word they say so they can't ever take you by surprise. For the next couple of weeks, I paid close attention to my parents, looking for possible signs of divorce. But I didn't see or hear anything unusual. And soon I got tired of watching and listening to them. Besides, whenever my parents fight, they end up laughing. In February, we celebrated Tootsie's first birthday. She carried on the family tradition of smashing her fist inside her birthday cake. Grandma, who believes in handing out gifts for everyone, not just the birthday person, brought me a 4-color ballpoint pen and Fudge a new book. Read, Fudge told Grandma. She put him on her lap and read him the latest story about Uriah, one of Brian Tumpkin's characters in the book. I used to really like his books when I was little, I said. I'm not a little kid, Fudge reminded me. Next year I'll be in 1st grade. You want to see a little kid? Look at the birthday girl. The birthday girl was sitting high in her high chair making a mess. Grandma had brought her a new baby-proof cup, one that refused to turn over no matter how hard she tried. Finally, Tootsie screeched, picked up the cup, and dunked her milk over her head. Tootsie's first birthday could go down as a real catastrophe, I said. What's a catastrophe? Fudge asked. There we go. Was when something goes wrong, I said. Or when everything goes wrong, Mom added. Talk about catastrophes. 6 weeks later, Tootsie learned to walk. At first, it was just a few feet at a time from Mom to Dad, from me to Fudge, but pretty soon she was toddling all over the place. Sometimes she'd crash land, and if no one was watching, she'd laugh and start all over again. But if she caught one of us looking at her, she'd start bawling and wouldn't stop until she got a cookie. Tootsie wasn't the only one crash landing. Fudge was learning to ride his bicycle. One of his major problems was stopping. Instead of using his brakes, he kept trying to jump off while his bike was still going. I was wrong when I told him he might get a couple of scraped knees. Elbows, knees, and head were more like it, constantly, but he refused to give up. He was really determined to get to ride to school. Finally, towards the end of April, Mom and Dad decided Fudge had mastered the art of bike riding well enough to ride to school with Daniel, who had learned on his front lawn, just the way he said he would, without a bruise or scrape anywhere. And it would have have turned out okay if Fudge had remembered to use his brakes when he got to the rack at school. But he didn't. So he crashed into the rack, knocking down a pile of bikes, and he wound up with scraped elbows, scraped knees, and torn jeans. Don't tell Mommy, Fudge said, or she'll never let me ride to school again. I think Mommy's going to notice anyway, I said. You're a mess. I carried him into the nurse's room. Miss Elliott washed off his cuts and bruises with peroxide, and when she did, Fudge let out a howl. Not that I blamed him. I could practically feel that sting myself. But Fudge didn't stop with one howl. He kept it up, making such a racket that Mr. Green, the principal, heard him and came running. What's going on down here? Scrape knees and elbows. Scrape knees and elbows, Mr. Green repeated. When I was a boy, I had scraped knees and elbows all the time. Used to roller skate and fall down week after week. Fudge sniffled and said, Too bad you weren't any good at it. Who says I wasn't any good at it? Mr. Green asked. You just said you were always falling down. Well, that's because I took a lot of chances. Now I want you to hurry back to your classroom because we're having a surprise visitor in a little while. Well, who is it? It's a very famous man, someone who writes and illustrates children's books. His name is Brian Tumpkin. It's the name of the guy from that book Fudge got. Brian Tumpkin is alive, Fudge asked. Alive and well and on his way to school. Oh, wow. I never knew that. Did you know that, Peter? I never thought about it. Mr. Green faced Miss Elliott and said, Lucky break for all of us that he's agreed to do a program for our boys and girls. I'm afraid I don't know who it is, Miss Elliott said. Then you must be dumber than I thought, Fudge told her. First you put peroxide on my cuts without blowing to take away the sting, and now you don't know who Brian Tumpkin is? I never blow on cuts. You can spread germs that way. Mommy always blows when she puts on peroxide. Yes, well, Mr. Green said. Let's get back to class. It's almost time for our program. At 10 o'clock, we all filed into the auditorium. Mrs. Morgan, the librarian, introduced Brian Tumpkin, telling us that millions of kids have read and loved his books, and how lucky we were that he was able to make a last-minute stop at our school. Brian Tumpkin walked on stage. He was tall, with gray hair and a gray beard. He waved to us. Then he turned and beckoned to someone on backstage. I brought a friend with me. Come on, Uriah, hurry up. The boys and girls are waiting. Nobody came on stage, but Brian pretended that Uriah had. He had pretended to be holding his hand, and he kept talking to him as if he were really there. And I thought, either this guy is really wacko or he's a really good actor. Finally, he looked out at the audience and asked if any of us saw Uriah. Someone down front called out, I see him. I didn't even have to look. I knew who that voice belonged to. Well, who is it? You see, Brian Tumpkin, told the rest of us. One of you can see him. Come up here, young man. Next thing I knew, Fudge was on stage. I slid down in my seat. What's your name, young man? Fudge. Well, that's an unusual name, Brian said. I know it, Fudge said. Well, how would you feel about helping me out today, Fudge? It's a real privilege, he said. Wow, look at that big word. I couldn't believe it. He had finally learned how to use the word. You could see that Brian Tumpkin was impressed. He said, well, it's a real privilege for me, too. That makes it unanimous, Fudge said. My, you certainly have an impressive vocabulary. Uh-oh. I learn a lot of words at home. Well, that's wonderful. Some of them I'm not allowed to say in school. Some of them my bird can say, and his name is Uncle Feather. I slid lower down in my seat. What grade are you in, Fudge? Brian asked. Kindergarten. Well, who's your teacher? I started out in Ratface's class, but now I'm in Mrs. Ziv's class. She's oh my gosh. She's a lot nicer than Ratface. I cover my face with my hands. Let's get on with our chalk talk, shall we? What's a chalk talk? I'm going to sit down at my easel. Excuse me. And you're going to describe a person to me. And I'm going to draw that person. Do you think you can do that? Yes, it's a man. Oh, I'll need more help than that. Is he tall or short? He's tall. He's got a fat belly. It hangs over his pants, and he's mostly bald, but he's got some hair around the edges. And he wears glasses. He's got a pointy nose and a mustache that curls down around his mouth. Brian was drawing as fast as Fudge was talking. And he's got a crooked front tooth. His feet are really long, and he walks like this. And he gives us a demonstration. Like a duck, he asked. Yes. All of a sudden, I knew who Fudge was describing, and I wanted to get out of the auditorium as fast as I could. But then Fudge looked out at the audience and called, "Where are you, Peter? I can't see you." And I knew that I couldn't get up without everybody looking at me, so I slouched down as low as I could, and I didn't answer. "Peter, can you see me?" I let out a groan. Joanne, who was sitting behind me, giggled. "I can't find my brother." "Well, you'll find him later," Brian said. "Now, you haven't told me what this man is wearing." "Oh, well, he's wearing a blue shirt, a tie with stripes. Brown pants, brown socks, brown shoes, and brown shoelaces." "Brown shoelaces," Mr. Tumpkin repeated. "Okay, there we are. Does he look like anyone you know, Fudge?" "Yes," Fudge said. "Who?" "Mr. Green." The audience laughed. "Who's Mr. Green?" Brian asked. "The principal." Now the audience roared. "Oh dear, oh my." He put his hand to his mouth, and you could see that he was trying really hard not to laugh. Mr. Green went up on stage and introduced himself to Brian. They shook hands, and Mr. Green said, "I think that's a wonderful drawing, and I'd like it for my office. Would you sign it for me?" "Certainly. I'm glad you like it." He signed his name across the drawing and handed it to Mr. Green. Then Fudge said, "Mr. Green, was this a catastrophe?" And Mr. Green laughed and said, "Not quite, but I'm sure you'll try harder next time." I sure was too. All right, stay tuned. We have one more chapter.